This is the fourth section of my interview with Bryan Dewsbury of the Knowledge Unbound podcast. In this section, we talk about Bryan's favorite character in my novel, Adequate Yearly Progress, but also the discussion goes into something that has always been interesting to me and seems to have also been interesting to Bryan, which is what does it mean to be part of a community, and especially what does it mean to be part of a community as a teacher?
So my favorite character, and I'm blanking on names because it's been a while since I've read it, but there was a teacher from Philly, and she was in, I don't want to spoil the ending for people, but she was in love with a poet, and so you followed her for a while, and some decisions that she made. And maybe I like that character because of one of the things that I'm sensitive to or maybe very interested in terms of humanization of education is that people are complex, situations are complex, identity is complex, right? And very often, you didn't say this explicitly, but I think you implied it several times in this conversation. Very often, the achievement conversation, the equity in education conversation gets boiled down to simple matters of black and white and poor and rich and low income, not low income. And those variables exist, but somebody who presents as a person of color, that presentation doesn't necessarily speak to the complexity and the non-linearity of their experience, right? And what they're navigating with respect to that. And I'm partly saying this as somebody who is of color and who's an immigrant and grew up in a culture where, that was still my identity, but how that unfolded in Trinidad is different to how it unfolded in my 25 years in the US. And that character wasn't international, but I think there was some of that in her past. So I loved how that came out. And I imagine that it took a little bit of work to explore that and to figure out how to tell that story. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so I love hearing you as a reader say that because it's perfect. It's a perfect, I'm so glad that someone read it and took that away, because that was one of the things that needs to be explored if you're going to get a panoramic view of education, which is the character that you are describing. Her name is Lena Wright. She's the English teacher character. And I think English in particular is a teaching subject that attracts people who want to discuss things with students and open students' minds. And also, there's a lot of personality in deciding how and what to teach English. As much as you might try to give guidelines to teachers, your personality is going to come through quite a bit, and your viewpoint is going to come through quite a bit, whether you want it to or not, as an English teacher. So this is a teacher who comes from a very educated background. She's African American, so she looks like quite a few of her students in this school. However, this school is predominantly not students whose parents are professors. She wants to teach her students based on what she thinks she can bring to the table, but also she was a way of exploring what teachers want out of being a teacher. And one of my theories going into the book, and also my theory in general, is we all want something out of being a teacher. And what she wanted out of being a teacher was to be part of a community, and specifically what she saw as her community. So yes, she grew up from a very educated and you could say privileged background. At the same time, she grew up as an only child in a very small family, no pets, not a lot of connection to what she would consider the wider culture. And so here she is in the South, hoping to reconnect. And that part is not going as well as she would have hoped. And especially because there are some flashbacks to her first year. She's not someone who is struggling in the typical new teacher movie way of classroom management. And she's a pretty dynamic and charismatic person. So she's not necessarily having trouble getting through to students, but at the same time, she's not coming off the way that she hoped to. That's part of what she needs to learn and figure out what she's going to do about it.
But that's okay. So I get that. But the honestly, the most powerful thing I took away from your description is you have somebody, and again, this is me betraying some personal experiences here. You have somebody who presents a certain way physically, and you find yourself in community with other people who present that way as well. But you are starkly reminded that in reality and in for many variables, you are kind of in the out group, right? And so how do you? I mean, there's no law saying that you have to be in the in group, but you still feel it, right? So even though you say, and I'll just be straight up. Like when I got to Morehouse College, historically black college, 99% black, all male identifying students, right? My accent stuck out, my music choices and stuff like that stuck out. But there was this part of you feeling like, oh, I'm supposed to like this music. I'm supposed to know more about these artists and things like that. And I know you didn't go into that much detail with his character, but just this message about assumption of monolithicity, is that a word? Monolithicness.
It is now.
It is now, right?
Sense.
Yeah, but you get what I'm saying, right? Yes. And knowing intellectually that that's not rational, but also still feeling psychologically like, am I supposed to? And it felt like that's what she was navigating.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And I think part of what you're pointing to is just like teachers have this abyss area of things they're never able to talk about because they are not supposed to exist. I think those exist in a lot of areas of our lives. And one of them, I do believe, can be connecting to your culture,
right,
or your culture in quotations.
Right.
Like, what is your culture? Wanting to be part of a community can be a very weird thing to admit. And then it also is hard to figure out.
Right.
I don't know if that's exactly... I guess I'm just kind of seconding your point in a different way. But I think it's okay to want to be part of a community. I think that can be a goal in your life that you're working toward. But it's just such a goofy thing to admit. Right. And then you can't ask the question, how, if you can't admit that that's what you'd like to do. Yeah. And that's something that I do explore through her, and also on behalf of teachers in general, because this is certainly not limited to her culture. I mean, I did see what I would perceive as this dilemma with many teachers teaching what would be supposedly their own culture if you took a picture of the class with the teacher in front of it. Yeah. Because there are so many variations. And if you hope to be an insider and you've been an outsider in various ways your whole life, which is her case, and then you find that you're an outsider in a completely different and unexpected way, even though on paper you may look like your students, for that particular character, that's something very difficult. Yeah. But in general, that's something that I think people struggle with. And I do feel like I'm in a totally different topic.
No, you're not. And again, sensitive to it partly because this is something I've been thinking about. In fact, I've been exploring with our colleague, Dr. E.C. Sarce Vega. We've been exploring a whole different way of thinking about belonging, because sometimes, and this is back to Lena, sometimes the assumptions are binary. It's like, to belong is good, to not belong is bad. And maybe without any kind of nuance that for a lot of people, your life is such that you're never really in a place where the belonging is just automatic. Is that your professional and personal life shapes and shifts, and between marriage, partners, friends, and stuff. What you're actually doing is you're always in a state of adaptation, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing, right? There are things to be learned from that. So I guess what I took from Lena was not so much, okay, is there a point where she could belong finally, but more of how is Lena just handling these several new circumstances that's forcing her to relook at her own identity. Right. And I don't think that question has to have one answer.
That makes a lot of sense. I like what you're saying about adaptation. And I think this is reminding me that what I had hoped to say about teaching. I think one of the dilemmas that people face in teaching, and more for some people than others, is what does it mean to be part of a community as a teacher? Because certainly a trap to avoid, and this is me talking as someone who gives advice to teachers, being one of the kids is not the target to aim for. Right. And that's not, she knows that.
Yeah.
But what does it mean to be embraced by a community when you are by nature, they're all sitting in seats, you're at the front of the class. They're the same age, you're a different age. Right. You're there to bring something they don't have. So you're not really going to be exactly part of the community in the way that a new kid moving to the high school and joining the student body would be, so what does it mean to become part of a community, but in the capacity of teachers? Because you're also probably not going to be best buddies with your students' parents who are closer to your age. So that was one of the things I explored through that character. And for a teacher that's important to, I think many of us, and I count myself in that group, I moved to a new city as a teacher. And I certainly didn't want to feel completely alone and isolated when I was there. A lot of teachers are teaching in the cities where they grew up, but often not the neighborhood where they grew up.
Right.
And then some teachers are teaching in the high school they went to high school. And so that's a whole different dilemma. And that is also addressed in the book in different ways.
In the final part of this interview, Bryan and I discuss what makes English or language arts different than almost any other subject for teachers. You can find the link to Bryan Dewsbury's podcast, Knowledge Unbound, plus links to everything that we spoke about in this discussion in the description underneath this video.